the time, and he supposed his life was over. He was mistaken. As a consequence of the meeting, he became one of the most beloved and respected human beings in history. The man he met was an automobile dealer, a Pontiac dealer named Dwayne Hoover. Dwayne Hoover was on the brink of going insane. There were 1,000,000,000,000 nations in the universe, but the nation Dwayne Hoover and Kilgore Trout belonged to was the only one with a national anthem which was gibberish sprinkled with question marks. The motto of Dwayne Hoover's and Kilgore Trout's nation was this, which meant in a language nobody spoke anymore, out of many, one, e pluribus unum. If they studied their paper money for clues as to what their country was about, they found, among a lot of other Baroque trash, a picture of a truncated pyramid with a radiant eye on top of it. Not even the President of the United States knew what that was all about. It was as though the country were saying to its citizens, "In nonsense is strength." A lot of the nonsense was the innocent result of playfulness on the part of the founding fathers of the nation of Dwayne Hoover and Kilgore Trout. The founders were aristocrats, and they wished to show off their useless education, which consisted of the study of hocus pocus from ancient times. They were bum poets as well. But some of the nonsense was evil, since it concealed great crimes. For example, teachers of children in the United States of America wrote this date on blackboards again and again and asked the children to memorize it with pride and joy. 1492. The teachers told the children that this was when their continent was discovered by human beings. Actually, millions of human beings were already living full and imaginative lives on the continent in 1492. That was simply the year in which sea pirates began to cheat and rob and kill them. Actually, the sea pirates, who had the most to do with the creation of the new government, owned human slaves. They used human beings for machinery, and even after slavery was eliminated because it was so embarrassing, they and their descendants continued to think of ordinary human beings as machines. The sea pirates were white. The people who were already on the continent when the pirates arrived were copper-colored. When slavery was introduced onto the continent, the slaves were black. Color was everything. When Dwayne Hoover and Kilgore Trout met each other, their country was by far the richest and the most powerful country on the planet. It had most of the food and minerals and machinery, and it disciplined other countries by threatening to shoot big rockets at them or to drop things on them from airplanes. Most other countries didn't have doodly squat. Many of them weren't even inhabitable anymore. They had too many people and not enough space. They had sold everything that was any good, and there wasn't anything left to eat anymore, and still the people went on fucking all the time. Fucking was how babies were made. Everybody in America was supposed to grab whatever he could and hold on to it. Some Americans were very good at grabbing and holding, were fabulously well-to-do. Others couldn't get their hands on doodly squat. Dwayne Hoover was fabulously well-to-do when he met Kilgore Trout. A man whispered those exact words to a friend one morning as Dwayne walked by. Fabulously well-to-do. And here's how much of the planet Kilgore Trout owned in those days. Doodly squat. And Kilgore Trout and Dwayne Hoover met in Midland City, which was Dwayne's hometown, during the Arts Festival there in the autumn of 1972. As has already been said, Dwayne was a Pontiac dealer who was going insane. Kilgore Trout became a pioneer in the field of mental health. He advanced his theories disguised as science fiction. He died in 1981, almost 20 years after he made Dwayne Hoover so sick. Dwayne was a widower. He lived alone at night in a dream house in Fairchild Heights, which was the most desirable residential area in the city. Every house there cost at least $100,000 to build. Every house was on at least 4 acres of land. Dwayne's only companion at night was a Labrador retriever named Sparky. Sparky could not wag his tail because of an automobile accident many years ago, so he had no way of telling other dogs how friendly he was. He had to fight all the time. His ears were in tatters. He was lumpy with scars. Dwayne had a black servant named Lottie Davis. She cleaned his house every day. Then she cooked his supper for him and served it. Then she went home. She was descended from slaves. Lottie Davis and Dwayne didn't talk much, even though they liked each other a lot. Dwayne reserved most of his conversations for the dog. He would get down on the floor and roll around with Sparky, and he would say things like, "You and me, Spark," and "How's my old buddy," and so on. And that routine went on unrevised even after Dwayne started to go crazy, so Lottie had nothing unusual to notice. Hugo Trout owned a parakeet named Bill. Like Dwayne Hoover, Trout was all alone at night except for his pet. Trout, too, talked to his pet, but while Dwayne Hoover babbled to his Labrador retriever about love, Trout sneered and muttered to his parakeet about the end of the world. Any time now, he would say, and high time, too. It was Trout's theory that the atmosphere would become unbreathable soon. Trout did another thing that some people might have considered eccentric. He called mirrors leaks. It amused him to pretend that mirrors were holes between two universes. If he saw a child near a mirror, he might wag his finger at a child warningly and say with great solemnity, "Don't get too near that leak. You wouldn't want to wind up in the other universe, would you?" Sometimes somebody would say in his presence, "Excuse me, I have to take a leak." This was a way of saying that the speaker intended to drain liquid waste from his body through a valve in his lower abdomen. And Trout would reply waggishly, "Where I come from, that means you're about to steal a mirror," and so on. By the time of Trout's death, of course, everybody called mirrors leaks. That was how respectable even his jokes had become. Trout's employer and co-workers had no idea that he was a writer. No reputable publisher had ever heard of him, for that matter, even though he had written 117 novels and 2,000 short stories by the time he met Dwayne. He made carbon copies of nothing he wrote. He mailed off manuscripts without enclosing stamped, self-addressed envelopes for their safe return. Sometimes he didn't even include a return address. He got names and addresses of publishers from magazines devoted to the writing business, which he read avidly in the periodical rooms of public libraries. He thus got in touch with a firm called World Classics Library, which published hardcore pornography in Los Angeles, California. They used his stories, which usually didn't even have women in them, to give bulk to books and magazines and salacious pictures. They never told him where or when he might expect to find himself in print. Here is what they paid him. Doodly squat. They didn't even send him complimentary copies of the books and magazines in which he appeared, so he had to search them out in pornography stores. The titles he gave his stories were often changed. Pan-Galactic Straw Boss, for example, became mouth crazy. Most distracting to Trout, however, were the illustrations his publishers selected, which had nothing to do with his tales. There had been a time when a copy of Trout's most popular book to date, Plague on Wheels, had brought as much as $12 because of the illustration. It was now being offered for $1, and people who paid even that much for it did so not because of the pictures. They paid for the words. The words in the book, incidentally, were about life on a dying planet called Lingo 3, whose inhabitants resembled American automobiles. They had wheels. They were powered by internal combustion engines. They ate fossil fuels. They weren't manufactured, though. They reproduced. They laid eggs containing baby automobiles, and the babies matured in pools of oil drained from adult crankcases. Lingo 3 was visited by space travelers who learned that the creatures were becoming extinct for this reason. They had destroyed their planet's resources, including its atmosphere. The space travelers weren't able to offer much in the way of material assistance. The automobile creatures hoped to borrow some oxygen and to have the visitors carry at least one of their eggs to another planet where it might hatch, where an automobile civilization could begin again. but the smallest egg they had was a 48-pounder, and the space travelers themselves were only an inch high, and their spaceship wasn't even as big as an Earthling shoebox. They were from Zeltoldemar. The spokesman for the Zeltoldemarians was Kago. Kago said that all he could do was to tell others in the universe about how wonderfully automobile creatures had been. Here is what he said to all those rusting junkers who were out of gas. You will be gone, but not forgotten. Trout received only one fan letter before 1972. It was from an eccentric millionaire who hired a private detective agency to discover who and where he was. Trout was so invisible that the search cost $18,000. The fan letter came much too late. It wasn't good news. It was perceived as an invasion of privacy by Kilgore Trout. The letter from Rosewater promised that he would make Trout famous. This is what Trout had to say about that with only his parakeet listening. Keep the hell out of my body bag. A body bag was a large plastic envelope for a freshly killed American soldier. It was a new invention. I do not know who invented the body bag. I do know who invented Kilgore Trout. I did. And 2 months after Trout received his first fan letter, I had him find in his mailbox an invitation to be a speaker at an arts festival in the American Middle West. The letter was from the festival's chairman, Fred T. Berry. He was respectful, almost reverent about Kilgore Trout. He beseeched him to become one of several distinguished out-of-town participants in the festival, which would last for 5 days. It would celebrate the opening of the Mildred Berry Memorial Center for the